Bad Luck Charlie Short Story Podcast, production by Lynn and Dave. Episode 5, The Great Evacuation. Charlie looked at the paper, then back at Boris, then at Janet. This was way more than he'd signed up for, but he could feel Janet's hand slip into his, steadying him. Okay, Boris, Charlie said, doing his best to sound confident. Consider it done. As Boris nodded and turned to leave, Janet pulled Charlie close and whispered, See, you're already doing great at this detective thing. Charlie forced a smile. Yeah, if by great you mean I've got a target on my back, let's just get out of here. They made their way out of the burger joint, and as they walked back to the car, Charlie glanced down at the paper in his hand, his heart pounding. So what's the plan, Detective? Janet asked, grinning up at him. Charlie took a deep breath. The plan? Simple. We're going to track down whoever this is, solve the mystery, and keep our heads down. What could possibly go wrong? But as they drove off, he couldn't shake the feeling that the next twist in his honeymoon investigation was just around the corner, and it was going to be a doozy. Charlie and Janet pulled up to their house in the dead of night, only to be greeted by a bizarre scene on the front lawn. Janet's dad, Mr. Pickens, was lugging boxes to an old, creaking U-Haul truck, muttering to himself as he loaded what looked like half the house. Daddy, what's going on? Janet cried, rushing over to him. When he turned to her, she gasped. His nose was bloody and both eyes were black and swollen. Janet, honey, he said, clutching his back, the mob paid me a little visit this afternoon. Told me I had to clear out of town, and they weren't asking nicely. Oh, my gosh, why would they do that? Janet asked, looking horrified. They're not the only ones telling us to leave, Mr. Pickens continued, nodding toward the rest of the street. The mayor shut the whole town down, says the power plant leaked some kind of radiation, condemned the entire city. Radiation? Charlie's eyes bulged. They're evacuating everyone? Mr. Pickens nodded a little frantically. You have to leave now, too. Everyone's packing up, trying to get out before they shut the roads. Grab what you can and take Otto with you. He's waiting in the park and wants to talk to you before you go. Daddy, Janet said, hugging him tightly, I'm so sorry. We'll get out of here and figure something out, I promise. But there wasn't much time for heartfelt goodbyes. Around them, the whole neighborhood was in complete chaos. Their neighbors were sprinting to and fro, tossing everything they owned into cars and trucks in a frenzy. Across the street, Mrs. Bixby was hauling her entire garden gnome collection into her minivan, muttering, Nobody's getting my Ralph, Calvin, or Steve, not even the mob. A few houses down, old man Hank was trying to strap his antique armchair to the roof of his old rusty sedan, yelling, I'll be back for the rest, don't you worry. Meanwhile, a man with half his head shaved was sprinting down the street with a box of fireworks under one arm and a mattress balanced on his head, looking for all the world like he'd gone completely off the rails. Janet grabbed Charlie's arm. Come on, we need to get Otto. They jumped into Charlie's muscle car, which sputtered to life with a cough and a backfire before roaring down the road. The streets were a mess, horns blaring, dogs barking, people shouting as everyone tried to flee at once. They reached the park just as Otto stood up from his usual spot on the bench, his old trench coat flapping in the wind. He looked unbothered, holding his cane like he had all the time in the world. Otto, Charlie called, pulling up beside him. We got to get out of here. The whole town's being evacuated. Otto raised an eyebrow and gave Charlie a crooked grin. Leaving, are we? Can't say I'm surprised. Good idea to keep ahead of the trouble, eh? As Otto climbed into the back seat, they saw Mayor McGrady himself waving a bullhorn from his car as he drove through the streets. Attention, everyone, for your safety, please evacuate. If you leave anything behind, it's the property of the Russian mafia, who now seem to own half this town. I repeat, evacuate immediately. Can you believe this? Charlie muttered, trying to keep his hand steady on the wheel. A whole town just condemned? And the mob gets to keep whatever's left behind? Otto chuckled from the back seat. The Russians? They'll have their hands full picking through the junk. By tomorrow they'll be selling lawn ornaments and broken furniture in their new empire. They sped down Main Street, where businesses were abandoning ship just as fast. The burger joint had a closed forever sign dangling off one hinge, and the bakery's entire staff was tossing loaves of bread into a truck, probably to use as emergency rations. They passed by Jerry's hardware store just as Jerry himself was hoisting a sledgehammer into his pickup truck, yelling, You want my wrenches, you mob rats, over my dead body. Cars were lining up at the edge of town, each vehicle packed to the roof with random belongings. Kids' toys, potted plants, rolled-up carpets, and one very confused golden retriever were pressed against the windows. People waved frantically at one another as they sped toward the town limits. But right at the edge of town, a mobster in a pinstripe suit stood leaning against a massive black SUV, smirking at the mayhem, as though he'd just won the lottery. Charlie tightened his grip on the wheel. I can't believe they're actually taking over the town. Otto leaned forward between Charlie and Janet, eyes twinkling. Oh, they might have won this round, but mark my words, they won't hold on to it for long, and when the dust settles, that little empire of theirs will be nothing but ashes. Janet, caught up in the chaos and adrenaline, turned to Charlie. What now, Detective? Charlie laughed, the whole situation so absurd that he almost felt like he was dreaming. Now we get out of here, figure out our next steps, and maybe grab a bite to eat that isn't from a mob-owned burger joint. They sped off, joining the convoy of townsfolk fleeing the disaster. But there was something thrilling about the escape, and as they watched the mayhem fade in the rearview mirror, they knew one thing. Whatever came next, it was bound to be unforgettable.